Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a class on halacha. We are learning about Bishul Akum. Bishul Akum is basically food cooked by non-Jewish people for our consumption. Are we allowed to eat it? What are we concerned about? Are we concerned about the ingredients? Are we concerned about something else? We are going to learn that tonight. The Gemara, actually we'll learn a Mishnah first, in Masechet Avodah Zarah says, Elo devarim shel goyim asurin. The following things of non-Jews are prohibited. Ve'en isurin isur hana'ah. And the prohibition is not a prohibition of deriving benefit. It's just a prohibition of eating it. And here are they. Chalav shechalbo goy. Milk that was milked by a non-Jew, ve'en Yisrael ra'ehu, and there was no Jew to oversee him. Hapat v'hashemen shelahen, the bread and their oils, ushlakot, and their cooked foods. The Gemara says on these, and we're going to actually have other classes on milk and on bread and others. Right now, we're just going to look at today is this one here, this word here, shlakot, the cooked food of a non-Jew. So it says here, shlakot, menahanemile. From where do we know this? Is there a pasuk that we'll know that it is prohibited to eat non-Jewish food? Amar Rabbi Chia ba'Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra. Rabbi Chia ba'Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the following verse, Ochel bakesef tashbireni va'achalti, umayim bakesef titen li v'shatiti. The pasuk says in Devarim, Perek Bet, pasuk kafchet, you shall sell me food for money that I may eat, and give me water for money that I may drink. Says as follows, kamayim, just like water, ma mayim shelo nishtanu, just as water in its unchanged form, af ochel shelo nishtana, so too food in its unchanged form, i.e. raw food and not cooked food. What we're talking about here in Devarim Perek Bet is talking about the Jewish people as they're making their way towards Eretz Yisrael, that when they went through the lands of the non-Jewish people, that the people of Edom would not, they're saying, let us go through and we'll buy food and drink. But here it's saying that the food and drink should be raw. Says the Gemara, if that's true, Ela ma'ata chitin va'asa'an klayot, so too it should be prohibited to have roasted grains. V'hatanya, hachanami da'asurin, they should be prohibited to eat them. V'chitem hachaname, and if you say that's true, v'hatanya, there's a braita which says chitin v'asa'an klayot, if you took wheat kernels and puffed them into roasted grains, mutarin, they are allowed to be eaten. So I'm confused. If I'm going to learn the pasuk properly, it should be any form of any cooking or roasting or growing of any food by a non-Jew should be prohibited. And yet here we have grains which are puffed into roasted grains that are permitted. Says the Gemara, Ela medarabanan. No, this is not a d'oraita. This is not a Torah prohibition. Ela medarabanan is only a rabbinic position. But wait, you just quoted a pasuk. And says the Gemara, Ukra asmachta be'alma. No, this pasuk is merely hinting at the rabbinic transgression. It's not really an actual issue. It's not actually a Torah pasuk, it's only rabbinic in nature, and I can rely, literally samuch, I can rely on or lean on that pasuk, but it's actually only rabbinic in nature. The pasuk is a mere support. Okay, now that we've established that it's rabbinic in nature, the cooking of food by non-Jews for Jewish people, why did the rabbis think in the Talmud that it was D'oraita? Why did they think it was Torah law? Surely they should have known that it was rabbinic. Tosafot says and explains here that this is an ancient decree, that Bishul Akum, the food cooked by non-Jews, is much older than these later ones, such as Patakum, bread cooked by non-Jews, or milk cooked by milked by non-Jews, but or cheese made by non-Jews. But the actual cooking food in general, that's a much older position. And here we see it in source number 3. And on that, Omer Rabbeinu Tam says, that which the Talmud, the rabbis in the Talmud were asking about cooked food, that they actually thought perhaps it was a Torah level. Shema gezerah kadmoniti, because perhaps they thought it was an ancient decree, v'lo nigzara im hapat, and it wasn't decreed together with bread. V'ha'ushlakot hi inyane tavshil kedamashma b'hachshmatata. And the word shlakot here relates to cooking and is evident from the discussion here. Don't think of shlakot as just vegetables. Umitchila, what was the reason for the decree? Gazu aleha mitam chatnut. The reason was because of chatnut. What is chatnut? Because of intermarriage. There was a concern that if we allow non-Jews to cook food for Jewish people, it would lead to intermarriage. V'al hapat lo gazeru, but about bread, they did not make this decree initially. Mishum dino shayach bechatanot kolkach, because at that period of time, the concern of intermarriage was not as severe. Ad sheba'u Shammai v'Hillel, until the generation of Shammai and Hillel, v'gazru, and they made the decree on 18 different things. B'shmona asar devarim, gam al hapat, including also over bread. V'af al gav dematnitin tane pat, and even though our Mishnah first teaches bread and only afterwards teaches vegetables or cooked foods, mikol makom shlakot gezerah kadmonit yoter haita. Nevertheless, cooked food in general was a much older previous decree than it was bread. And when they permitted certain things for bread, lo hitiru shlakot mahaita'ama, they did not permit cooked food. Dapat ushlakot trei mile ninhu, because bread and cooked food in general are two separate things.
Rabbi, how do you define bread here? Is bread like water challah? How did they bake bread back then? What kind of ingredients are we talking about?
Excellent question, Ita. We're going to get more into what they mean by bread in a later class on patakum and what specifically they were concerned with. But very interestingly, the sources seem to suggest that you can mask what's in cooked food much easier than you can mask bread, implying that bread was a much more simpler process back then, which was much more water and flour than it is today with the many, many different ingredients. So therefore, they weren't concerned as much with the ingredients as they were with intermarriage. Whereas with cooked food, it seems the main issue, along with intermarriage, was also that you actually couldn't identify what was put in the food itself. Perhaps they were sneaking in something non-kosher.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Sharon, go for it.
What does intermarriage have to do with this? Are we getting to that, or did I miss it?
We're going to get further into why chatnut is such an issue. Jerry and I are the only men on this on this call, but I'll tell you that men generally think with their stomachs, and I don't mean that as a stereotype, but generally you can make a man very happy by the food that you make. And there was a concern that home-baked food or homemade food in particular, was very, if not done directly, even just by the by, it has a major impact on the way that a man thinks, and that subconsciously can lead to desire for marriage, even if that isn't the first thing on their mind at the beginning. But we're going to see it. It certainly seems far as we begin reading the sources, but as we're going to read here, it's going to continue. So what was the specific reason that Chazal instituted this decree? According to Rabbeinu Tam, it was due to concern for chatnut, or intermarriage with non-Jews. This is also the approach of the Rishonim, such as the Tosafot Reed and the Ritva. But the Hagat Asheri cites the Rashbam that the reason for the prohibition is due to the concern that the Gentile may feed the Jew non-kosher food, which presumably means that he may include non-kosher ingredients in the cooked food, even if the external appearance of the dish seems to be kosher. And we can see that here in source number 4. Uvarashbam katav b'shem rabotenu, the bishule goyim ne'esa mishum gezerah. And the reason why cooked foods by a non-Jew are forbidden is because of a rabbinic decree. And what was the decree? Shema yochilenu goy davar tameh. Perhaps the non-Jew will feed him something tameh, something non-kosher, something literally impure. What's interesting here in source 5 and 6 is that Rashi gives two different positions. When he's explaining the Mishnah, he says, Kol davar shebishlu goy v'afilu bekli tahor v'kulhu mishum chatnut. In the Mishnah, he says the reason is because of intermarriage. But when he says that the reason is rabbinic, he says, Shelo Yisrael ragil etzlo b'ma'achalu mishteh. Why should he not be accustomed to be with him regularly? V'yochlenu davar tameh, because perhaps he will feed him something non-kosher. So Rashi brings both positions down, one because of intermarriage, one because the food may be non-kosher. The Aruch HaShulchan, a much later rabbi who lived in the late 19th, early 20th century, writes here, Rov HaPoskim Katvu, most of the later poskim write, Tam Isur Shlakot Mishum Chatnut. The reason is because of intermarriage. V'yesh merabotenu shekatvu hatam, and there are those rabbis that write that the reason is shelo yachilenu davar isur, that one should not be fed something forbidden. That's the Ashire and the Rashbam, and as I said, Rashi brings both answers there. And here it says in bold, ve'efshar, and it's possible, sheta'amohu lama hikilu b'pat v'lo b'shlakot, the reason why they were leaning concerning bread, but not for cooked food, mishum de b'shlakot yesh shnei ta'amim. With cooked food, there are two reasons. U'v'pat lo shayach, but with bread, this is not hachashash hasheni machilat davar isur. The second reason that the food might be being fed something non-kosher is not appropriate. Why? Because you can tell instinctively what's inside the bread. But that is not the case with cooked food. And therefore, the rabbis made a general rule. All cooked food by non-Jews is prohibited, but not so with bread. With bread, there's particular leniencies depending on the scenarios, and again, we'll go into that in the coming weeks. And here you have a little bit of background on who the Aruch HaShulchan was, and you can see it here, but there we go. So according to the Aruch HaShulchan, Rashi holds that the enactment of Bishul Akum was instituted for both reasons. Pat akum, on the other hand, is only forbidden because of intermarriage, since the concern of eating non-kosher is not applicable. The reason is that in those times, it was easy to tell whether other non-kosher ingredients were added to the bread simply by looking at it, something which today is a lot harder to do. Okay. The Pitchet Shuvah explains that a practical difference between the two reasons arises in the case of a Jew who is a mumar, or a heretic, meaning that he does not observe the Torah. So let's understand what happens if I have a nice Jewish friend who's not totally observant of halacha. Am I allowed to eat their food, or do I consider their food to be the food cooked by a non-Jew? Let's say, again, that they have kosher dishes and all their ingredients are kosher. It says as follows, Ayin ber hetev shel maharit shekatav. Go and have a look over there. De'ika ha-gezerah hayta mishum chatnut. What's the main reason of the gezerah? Because of intermarriage. And have a look at the Sefer Tirat LeMoshe shekatav. De'lefi ta'am zeh shareh bishul shamuma. Therefore, from this reason alone, it should be permitted to eat food cooked by a secular Jew, because there's no concern of intermarriage. Rather, there is another reason given by the Beit Yosef. Perhaps they will feed you something non-kosher inside of it. And according to this reason, gam bishul shamumar asur, then food cooked by a non-Jew would be food cooked by a secular Jew would be problematic. Since they are considered a heretic to the entire Torah, I would be concerned that they would forbid you, they would feed you something forbidden. Ayin sham, have a look over there. And according to this, hu hadin mumar lechalel Shabbat b'farhesia. This is referring to a Jew who does not keep Shabbat publicly, or lekol haTorah kula, or any aspect of the entire Torah. The dinah goy, we treat that person, someone who breaks Shabbat, we treat them like being of a status of a non-Jew. Now, again, there's a whole class that we can go into about today, whether we hold like that, whether someone who is not knowledgeable and the reason why they don't keep Shabbat is out of ignorance, not because they're trying to be a mumar, they're not trying to be a heretic, they just don't know. If they truly understood, that wouldn't be the way that they were. And that's a longer class, but generally speaking here, there is this concern that perhaps either wantonly or not, perhaps most likely out of ignorance, they may serve you something non-kosher. Most likely they might serve you something which has, they may think it doesn't have a kosher symbol, but they don't see that it has anything non-kosher in it. They're not trying to deliberately mislead you, they just don't understand kosher symbols and the more fundamentals of keeping a kosher home.
So is this the source of why a mashgiach must be shomer Shabbat?
This is the source, Ito. Well done. Exactly right. We're going to see here, often when you see the VAD, we'll put out a sign saying, looking pays well, you need to have flexible hours, and what are the responsibilities, what are the limiting factors, that you are shomer Shabbat, and that you know how to, and you have some skill in checking bugs, checking for bugs of vegetables, but it's you need to be shomer Shabbat. If you're not shomer Shabbat, then you're not trustworthy in this matter. Also, it's also an issue of ne'emanut, of being able to give testimony and to testify on kashrut matters. Women are able to do so as well, but whoever it is, a man or a woman, they need to be Shabbat observant to be considered a reliable witness in this matter. Great question. Continuing, according to the Pitchet Shuvah, the reason concerning intermarriage would not apply to a secular Jew, since a Jew is allowed to marry a secular Jew or his children, but concern would still exist that perhaps the secular Jew may use non-kosher ingredients when cooking. Practically, many poskim write that in the case of need, or may be lenient with a Jewish heretic who publicly desecrates Shabbat, or who does not observe the rest of the Torah, cooks and eat the food, assuming that one verifies that all the ingredients are kosher. This is the conclusion of the Sitz Eliezer, and you can see that there. This is the ruling that emerges from our investigation of this, that there is no reason to be concerned with Bishul Akum for the canned goods produced and cooked in the factories whose owners have relinquished the yoke of mitzvot and publicly desecrate Torah. God forbid, when there is a Torah student who is God-fearing, appointed over them and supervising and serving as mashgiach with the watchful eye on everything that happens there. So you don't need to have, and here's the practical scenario, I don't need, if I've got secular Jews who are the cooking and there happens to be a mashgiach in there, I don't need to have the mashgiach turn on the pilot light then. We're going to go into more about the role of the mashgiach and Sfaradim and Ashkenazim and how much does the mashgiach have to be involved in the cooking, but that's going to be later, either later tonight or more likely next week. On the other hand, Hacham Ovadia Yosef says, Lechatchila, ideally one should try to be strict and ensure that in a factory, the mashgiach should always be the one who turns on the machines, and at home, a religious Jew should always cook the food. As he says here, Herachti, I elaborated on the halacha concerning whether cooking done by a mumar for the public desecration of Shabbat has the status of Bishul Akum, and I emerged with the strength of permission, and we only wrote that in order to do the best thing with regard to canned food made in non-religious kibbutzim, the rabbi who is the mashgiach for kashrut should press the electronic button to begin cooking, but this is only for do not be called wicked by refraining from being good. As it says, Zot mishum mehiyot tov al tikre ra. Okay, so here we're saying this is only an ideal, and it's, there we are. And again here, regarding Mechalel Shabbat B'farhesia, someone who breaks Shabbat publicly, again here it's all a question of, is today's secular Jews, they're not the same as mumars, as heretics of the past, as we can go into a lot. And there's a lot of footnotes here, but again, beyond the scope of what we're talking about. I want to get into a little bit far more into what exactly is forbidden or what is considered Bishul Akum, okay? And the Gemara gives us two classical approaches, two main groups of what is of what that is. So it says here, Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav, Kol ha'me'echal kemot shu chai, anything which can be eaten raw, ein ba mishum bishulei nochrim, is not considered part of this decree. Besura matnuhachi, and that's how they explained it and taught it in Surah. So let's say I've got apples, and I can eat apples raw, I can eat oranges raw. Therefore, whatever, anything which could be eaten raw, there's no problem with it being cooked. So let's say carrots, I can eat carrots raw. I'm not concerned about carrots being cooked. Cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, you name it, anything which could be eaten raw, I have no problem with that being cooked. That's in one city called Sura in Bavel. The Pumpadita in another city in Bavel, Matnu Hacheh, they taught as follows: Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav, Kol she'eno ne'echal al shulchan melachim, lalefet bo et apat, anything which does not go up on the king's table as something to be eaten together with bread is not subject to the prohibition. So therefore, anything which is not considered important is not considered a problem. So therefore, I have two things: A, anything raw, and B, and number two, anything which does not go up aleh hashulchan, onto the table of kings, okay, or leaders or important people. So how do we rule like this? Since it's rabbinic, we add and we say if it's either it can be eaten raw or doesn't go up on the king's table, it's not considered part of the decree. And that's the way that Tosafot rules. Psak Rabbeinu Tam in source number 13 here. The hilchata kahane trei lishnei v'ika chad b'naihu o nechal chai o eno ole ein bo mishum bishulei of de kochavim the b'shel sofrim halach acha hamekel. So he says here, we have two. We don't say it has to have both of those. It has to have either one or the other, because we're lenient because it's only a rabbinic decree. So provided it's one of the other, it can be eaten raw, or it's something which does not go up on the table of kings. And I know what you're asking. What isn't fit for the king's table? We're going to get into that. So it goes here in source. The Shulchan Aruch makes the following ruling. Rav Yosef Karo says there in source 14, Davar she'enon ne'echal kamo shehu chai, v'gam oleh al shulchan melachim lalefe bo'etz apat, או לפרפרת, שבשלו גוי, אפילו בכלי ישראל ובית ישראל, אסור משום בישולי גויים. An item that cannot be eaten raw and is also brought to a king's table to accompany bread or as a relish that is cooked by a non-Jew, even if it was cooked in a Jew's vessel and even in the Jew's home, it is forbidden due to Bishul Akum. Okay? So far, that's where we're up to. Questions until this point? Anything which needs to be clarified? Okay, pretty straightforward. All right. Now, what is considered to be eaten raw? They talked about a betzah tzluya, and a roasted egg. Bar kapara shareh. Bar kapara permitted eating an egg roasted by a non-Jew. Rabbi Yochanan asar, and Rabbi Yochanan prohibited it. Why was that? Presumably, Bar Kapara held you can eat a raw egg, whereas Rabbi Yochanan held you don't eat raw eggs. That's not the normal way of eating it. And that's what the Beit Yosef explains. Maran Beit Yosef, that's Rav Yosef Cairo on the Torah, says, Af agav de besar uya legum'a chaya, lo mikre ne'echa kemot shu chai, de'ein zo achila chashuva. Even though you can swallow an egg raw, let's say you're a health junkie and you like to put them in your protein shakes or whatever before you go for a run, I don't know, or after you're running, that is not the normal way of eating it, and it's not considered chashuv. It's not considered the significant manner of eating, and that's what's important. And the Aruch HaShulchan here explains that we go after the majority. Holchin achar rov b'nei adam. It's not enough for me to say, I eat raw eggs, therefore I can eat cooked eggs. We go after the majority of people. And if the majority of people where you live eat something in its raw state, great. But if the majority of people in your place do not, then you are what's known as out of luck. Okay, and you can see that there in source number 17. The Aruch HaShulchan explains that the majority is determined by one's locale, and whatever the majority of people in that country or region deem to be a normal manner of eating is accepted as the operative standard for Bishul Akum. Based on this, the Sefer HaKashrut rules that a food that is edible raw is not subject to Bishul Akum, even if cooked by a Gentile in such a manner that its appearance is totally changed. A food that is edible raw is still permitted to be eaten, even if it is cooked by a Gentile, to the point that it dissolves and its form is entirely changed, and it becomes exactly like a cooked dish. One interesting application to this is sushi. Okay, it used to be that most people outside of where sushi was traditionally eaten, let's say Japan, would say eating raw fish, that's disgusting. You have to eat it at least salted or smoked, but certainly cooked. And eating raw fish would be strange. But today, sushi is very, very popular. So I could say by today's standards, we could say that in the United States especially, eating raw fish is fine, and therefore raw fish would be allowed, any cooked fish would be allowed, since raw fish is permitted. So some poskim, such as Rav Menachem Ganak, the CEO of the OU, argues that fish today indeed is not subject to Bishul Akum. However, many poskim hold that sushi does not change the status of all fish, as brought down by Rav Eliezer Melamed in Israel. And perhaps the machloket, the argument here is that in Rav Menachem Ganak of the US is expressing that in America we eat a lot more sushi than perhaps they do in Israel with Rav Melamed.
So I have a question on that, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we eat sushi with cooked rice. Is cooked rice considered something you would put on a king's table?
We're going to get into King's Table right now, and then I'm going to ask you, Ita, to answer the question. I have my own position on rice, but hold on 30 to about 5 or 10 minutes, and I think you'll be able to answer your own question. Okay? So let's have a look here. So we've looked at one thing, what's eating raw food. Over here, we're now going to see what is considered oleh al hashulchan, served at the king's table. Is it anything that a king would eat, or is it something which is served specifically at the king, for example, at a state banquet? What's very interesting is it's something which came up. Is it something very fancy? What about potatoes? What about anything which comes from potatoes, like potato chips? Are they considered, let's say that I'll tell you in Buckingham Palace, I'm sure the Queen would never allow potato chips, but perhaps some of our presidents would eat potato chips. Is it what the king or the president eats, or is it what the king or the president would serve at a state banquet? So here we talk about potatoes. The Aruch HaShulchan writes, Tapuchei Adama, this is not considered something fit for the king's table. And if literally they're just being boiled, or we baked them or roasted them, it's totally permitted for a Jew to eat them. Why? This is very basic food. And it's only the lower class of people that eat them in large numbers because of their great poverty and their pressing need. Now it's interesting that I remember the Aruch HaShulchan lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Think about the great, what's it called? When the potato crop failed in Ireland and in other parts of the world, what tremendous pressure it caused on the poor people there, because that was the only food that they lived on. It was potatoes day in, day out, day in, day out. It was not considered something which was fitting, even though today many people like potato dishes. And even though wealthy people eat them sometimes, that's only because there's so much of them, but not because they are significant. But they would never make it to the king's table, not to accompany bread, nor to be as a relish. And it's only while they are cooking, when they are still soft. It's only then they might add a little bit of flavor to the spices, but they wouldn't eat it for an entire year. But I found that the Chochmat Adam, who lived in the early 1800s, that he said that potatoes were served at the king's table. And he says, Ulai bizman hakadmon, perhaps in the earlier times, shelo haya zeh b'nimtza, where it wasn't found as readily available, haya machal chashuv, then potatoes were important, which was about 100 years before. Aval, ata, but now, b'midinatenu, in our countries, shezarim ota lemarbe, where they are planted a lot of them, humachal rov ha'hamon, this is what the majority of the people eat, the masses. And it's extremely simple food. And it's the most tender and delicate person says, throw it forward, as in, who wants to eat that? It seems to my humble opinion, therefore I would say this is not considered something to go on the king's table. And one should think carefully about this issue. Okay, so he says even though it may once have been important, it's not anymore. It's common food, and therefore he says it's not considered part of the criteria of Bishul Akum. Having said all that, in contemporary times, the potato has once again become a distinguished food and one served at fancy dinners. Therefore, poskim today do consider it to be subject to Bishul Akum, as noted in the Sefer Kashrut, and you can see that over here. The definition in practice of food that is brought to the king's table depends on the location and the time, and there are sometimes some items whose status changes in light of the contemporary reality, as explained in the footnote, and it goes through there about potatoes in great detail. We should also note that although the Sefer HaKashrut holds that tuna fish is considered to be fit for a king's table, some North American kashrut organizations, as the OU, hold differently, and you can see that here. Essentially, the halachic position of the OU is that canned fish does not become forbidden as a result of Bishul Akum, because in the canning process of steaming the fish or cooking it, I might say that it's no longer fit, I can't eat it since it was cooked. Since the fish is not suitable for a state dinner, I would suggest that there's no issue. This argument is strongest for sardines, which are not gourmet fish. Indeed, the Levushai Mordechai testified that many European Torah scholars and great tzaddikim ate sardines which were prepared by non-Jews, although this was not a universal practice. Tuna and salmon are higher quality, and tuna steaks and baked salmon are served at elegant dinners. Nevertheless, the manner in which canned fish is prepared renders them inappropriate for a meal of the aristocracy. A gourmet chef would not attempt to prepare an exquisite fish platter with canned tuna, salmon, or sardines. What he could, he just wouldn't last very long. Coupled with this is the ruling of Rav Moshe Feinstein mentioned earlier that Bishul Akum does not apply to a factory. In the case of tuna, there is an additional mitigating factor. Unlike salmon and sardines, which are first cooked in the sealed can, tuna is steamed in a steam chamber before it's packed and recooked in the can. It's questionable whether the food that was steamed by a non-Jew is prohibited because of Bishul Akum at all. So therefore, we can see this, that we can be lenient here as well with all these canned foods. Having a look here in source 23, Rav Chaim Jachta, a rabbi on the East Coast, and the great Posek writes, a most significant exception is the food must be oleh al hashulchan melachim. It must be fit to go on the king's table. This rule can be interpreted in two possible ways. The Chazon Ish believes that it refers to food that is not of poor quality and will be eaten by a wealthy person. The Chazon Ish ruled that canned sardines cooked by non-Jews were forbidden because the King of England eats sardines for breakfast. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to agree with this strict ruling of the Chazon Ish. Rav Schwab notes that many of the great Rashi Yeshiva of pre-war Eastern Europe ate sardines cooked by non-Jews, and the practice of the Rashi Yeshiva appears to be in accordance with Rav Soloveitchik's interpretation of this rule. Rav Soloveitchik believes that Oleh HaShulchan Melachim means food has to be suitable to be served at a state dinner. So it's not enough that the king likes sardines, it's whether his team of staff would say, you know what? I think sardines should be on the menu for the visiting royalty. You don't do that. Rav Soloveitchik's interpretation has great implications, as according to his approach, almost no canned food would be included in the Bishul Akum prohibition, because food served at a state dinner is cooked fresh. According to the Chazon Ish, any food that is of good quality that would be eaten by a king or high dignitary at any meal would be considered Bishul Akum. But Rav Soloveitchik, on the other hand, only foods that would be served at a fancy state dinner are included, which limits the types of food that would be included. It would seem that the more accepted practice today is to follow Rav Soloveitchik's approach. This is indeed the approach expressed by Reb Heinemann of the Star K, as we shall see. The prohibition of Bishul Akum does not apply to foods that are not prestigious and would not be served at the king's table when hosting an official state dinner, e.g., baked beans or cornflakes. These foods are permitted because a person does not experience deep feelings of gratitude and appreciation when someone warms up a can of string beans. Therefore, cooking non-prestigious food would not bring on feelings of closeness between preparer and recipient. Any food that would not be served at a wedding feast because it is not elegant, e.g. donuts, would certainly not qualify for Bishul Akum. The Starkey asked the White House executive chef what the White House banquet policy is regarding the use of canned products of state dinners. A specific question was, what is the policy regarding canned cranberry sauce? We also asked whether potato chips are served at state dinners. The chef's response was as follows: we would serve whatever the guests wanted. However, we never serve potato and chips, nor do we ever use canned goods. Everything is prepared fresh. So, Ita, let's answer your own question. Is rice a problem or not?
I think it is a problem. I would put it in the same category as potatoes. And if we just read a few pages ago, potatoes was considered by some opinions as something that is fit for the king's table, then you can't rely, then you need a Jewish person to cook it. You can't have a non-Jewish person cook it. So I'd say for sushi, I would say, I know there's probably different opinions, but if you were to ask me, I would say you have to have somebody Jewish make it.
So, Ita, I don't like to disagree with you, but the reason why we have a Jew make the sushi is not because of Bishul Akum, it's because we're concerned that perhaps it's non-kosher fish. That's the issue. Regarding whether it's oleh al hashulchan, whether that's important food, it's an interesting point. Would sushi be served at a state banquet? I could imagine it sometimes being served at a state banquet. But sushi, yeah, I don't know. It's a hard one for me because I would say if someone served me plain rice, I wouldn't be that excited about it. I really wouldn't. I don't think it's that important.
But isn't it the same thing like plain potatoes? You wouldn't find plain boiled potatoes. I mean, I would think potatoes are part of, you could have a fancy potato salad.
Yeah, again, I think it depends on the quality. I think, depending where you want to rule on this, one could be very limiting the scope of how wide we express Bishul Akum. Do we limit it and say, you know what, it really has to be something really very, very fancy, something which cannot be eaten raw at all? Or do we say anything which would be possibly put on a table that can't be had? Because if you go with that much wider ruling, then virtually everything would be considered Bishul Akum, and we would be stuck. We won't be able to eat anything. And I think that's where it's coming from when you see that machloket there between the Chazon Ish and Rav Soloveitchik regarding is it what the king personally likes to eat or is what's served at the banquet? If we went by the more strict position of the Chazon Ish, then there'll be much fewer items which carry a hechsher that we would be allowed to eat.
Did you guys already talk about in a previous class about the definition of Bishul Akum?
Well, we've just described it here. We haven't described how far is the cooking process. That's what we're going to do next week.
That's what I'm getting at.
Next week we're going to get into how is the cooking process, and that we'll see. But I'm saying if I'm strict by being lenient with the canning process and saying no canned food would ever be served, that's why I'm allowed to eat all these foods. Right. Because the canning is cooking.
How do you classify pizza? Is pizza considered not fit for a king's table?
I don't think that's very. Again, if you're going by the Chazon Ish, there may be kings or leaders who like to eat pizza. But if you're going by Rav Soloveitchik's position, would it be fit for the king's table at a banquet? I don't think a pizza would be something you'd serve at a state banquet.
Right. All
If
right.
that makes sense. So let's
Yeah, it
finish
does.
off. I want to have a look at liquids, specifically going to the coffee shop and buying a coffee. Is that a problem of Bishul Akum, since the coffee beans are being boiled by the non-Jew? I might be a problem there. I'm going to give it away. It's permitted because we do it. But wait, why is it permitted? The Aruch HaShulchan explains, and we'll see this one in English, all of our teachers wrote that for this reason, there is no problem of Bishul Akum for beer, for just as the grain is nullified to the water concerning the beracha recited upon it, as we recite Shehakol, so too it is nullified with respect to the prohibition of Bishul Akum. Similarly, it's permitted to drink coffee and chocolate without milk, since it is nullified to the water. So therefore, I can have beer, I can have coffee. Why? Because we're saying the main thing is not the grain or the coffee bean. What's the main thing is the water. And therefore, since water can be eaten, can be drunk raw, there's no problem boiling the water and putting in the coffee beans or putting in the chocolate or putting in the grains to make the beer. Okay? And therefore, that's the position. Hacham Uvadiyah writes that this is entirely permitted to drink coffee prepared by a Gentile without question. And he says here, is it permitted to drink coffee cooked by a Gentile, or is it forbidden to do to Bishul Akum? And he states that any item that is eaten in its raw is not subject to the prohibition against eating the cooked food of Gentiles. For this reason, it's permitted to drink hot water boiled by a Gentile, and there is no problem of Bishul Akum. So it is drinkable even before being boiled. And one should not forbid beer from grain due to Bishul Akum, because although the grain is not edible raw, since it is nullified to the water concerning the bracha of Shehakoni Yabid Bara, so too the grain is nullified to the water concerning the prohibition of Bishul Akum. And from here, one can derive concerning coffee that even though the coffee is not edible raw, nevertheless, since the coffee is secondary to the water with respect to the fact that one must recite Shehakol, therefore, concerning Bishul Akum as well, the water is considered to be the primary component, and it follows that there is no prohibition of drinking the coffee based on food or drink cooked by a non-Jew. In summary, it is permitted to drink coffee prepared by Gentiles, and there is no concern of Bishul Akum. And the Achronim write that this is the custom that has spread everywhere, and if the halacha is uncertain in your hands, go out and see. Puk chazeh, go out and see what the people are doing. Okay? And practice it. And one who wishes to be stringent, he shall be blessed. And who is the one who wants to be stringent? This is the Chatam Sofer and the Shevet Halevi, and they write that regarding coffee, that indeed, if it's instant coffee, one should be concerned because the instant coffee is dissolved. However, all that being said, the bottom line says here, the widely accepted practice, though, is to be lenient about drinks without any hesitation. Okay. So that is, and I think we're gonna stop here on page 76. This is what we've learned so far, okay? And if we just go through it, one second, actually, let me just show you this. Let's go through the summary. Let me just go through a couple of pages here. Next week, we're gonna really go into all those questions of what is considered cooking by a non-Jew and how much does the Jew or the mashgiach have to be involved in it? Can we eat in restaurants? What about Ashkenazic, Sephardic? We're going to get into that. It's a really fascinating subject. Let's just go a little bit more. Give me a couple of seconds here. Let's see the summary of what we've learned here. We've looked at the Gemara, the Chazal decree that it's forbidden to eat foods cooked by Gentiles. What's the reason? Tosafot, because of intermarriage. Ashirei and the Rashbam because of non-kosher ingredients. Rashi brings both. The Aruch HaShulchan says both are relevant to Bishul Akum, but only the concern for intermarriage for bread cooked by non-Jews. Does Bishul Akum apply to non-religious Jews? Then we had those four positions there. Pitchet Shuvah, there was no problem of intermarriage, but there is a concern of non-kosher ingredients. Tzitz Eliezer, since its primary reason is intermarriage, there's no problem at all. Yakut Yosef, the custom is to be lenient. but it's best to be a mashgiach, and sefer kashrut in cases of need, or maybe lenient, but it's not the best thing to do. What foods are forbidden? And then we talked about this: foods that are not edible raw, food that is served at the king's table, and we went into the definitions. We followed the majority of people would eat raw, and the minority does not count. Is fish today considered edible raw? Yes, according to Rav Ganak. No, according to Rav Melamed. And then we said definition of food served at the king's table. The chazonish, whatever a king would eat, as opposed to Rav Soloveitchik, only food eaten at state dinner. And then we had there the liquids, Aruch HaShulchan and the Yakut Yosef. They are not subject to Bishul Akum. And the Shevet HaLevi, there is room for a God-fearing person to be strict. Okay, so therefore we've covered quite a lot today, and next time we're going to get into what exactly is Bishul Akum with a non-Jew cooking the food.